Chapter 13 of Stones and Water by Donna Napoli, Under Bushes. Roberto heard two people get out of the front of the truck. One of them walked around and opened the back. Roberto sat up. The old man blinked his eyes in surprise, then he shooed him away. Roberto bolted over to the side of the truck and ran past the other man, who was kneeling by a front wheel. Roberto saw the river at the end of the road. He ran straight for it. The men shouted. Their voices were startled. Roberto heard running. He left the road and ducked into the trees that flanked both sides of the river. He ran. Rain pounded in his left arm. Pain pounded, not rain. He held it across his chest. The running behind him got closer. He went down to the bushes at the water's edge. He stumbled and crawled far under a bush and cracked his head hard against something. Wet stuff ran down the bridge of his nose. He wiped it away. Blood. He let himself drop so that he lay flat on the ground, dizzy, aching in his arm, his knee, and now the top of his head. He shut his eyes. Lights danced behind his eyelids. He opened them and looked at the dirt. Nausea rose in his throat. He couldn't let himself vomit now. They'd hear. He put both hands over his mouth and tried to steady his stomach. He heard the men rush past. He waited. After a while, he heard them talking. Their voices got louder. They passed by again, close this time, very, very close. They kept walking back to the road. Roberto felt around under the bush. The thing he had bashed his head against moved when he pushed it. It was wooden. His groping hand closed over an open edge. His heart beat hard with rising hope. He worked his way out from under the bushes, pulling the wooden thing behind him. It was a boat. Roberto let his breath out in relief. He knew nothing really about how to fend off wild animals or how to stay warm in snow, but he knew about boats. Oh yes, he knew about boats. The boat was barely his body's length and only 3 times his width in the center. It had no seat. Roberto crawled back under the bushes and felt around. He grabbed a paddle. There was only one. He quickly eased the boat into the water, crunching through the last bits of thin ice that hadn't yet broken up at the very edge. He stood to paddle like in a gondola, but the handle of the paddle was too short. He had to kneel to make it work. It was tempting to hug the shore so that he could run less of a risk of being seen, but he didn't know if the men would come back in an instant with more men, so he let the current carry him to the center of the river where the water ran the fastest. He paddled like mad, skimming the top of the water. The river was shallow at this time of year. Bigger boats could never pass. Good. That meant he wasn't likely to meet others on the water, if only no one followed. He didn't rest until late afternoon. He must have covered a good 40 or 50 kilometers, and he'd seen no villages at all. Once he saw a few long-legged animals in the distance, maybe mules. They must have been out to pasture, but there weren't any people in sight. And once he saw a windmill. That's all. The river ran through a gently sloping, broad valley. Meadows filled huge depressions. There was no snow here, though the air wasn't much warmer than back in his boy's settlement. The grasses were dry yellow. On the west bank, he passed a dirt road that ran from the river's edge to a wooded area in the distance. It looked like it had been lumberjacked. He knew the way beyond the woods rose the white-capped Carpathians, but he couldn't see that far. Roberto was hungry, but just being on the water kept him calm. He sat in the bottom of the boat and stretched his legs. He thought over the past few days. He'd walked for 3 days before he found his boy. Taking off for the fact that sometimes he'd gone southeast instead of due south, he figured he must have traveled 50 kilometers southward each day. Maybe a bit less because he'd walked in snow most of the time, and he'd stopped to watch the soldiers pass, so maybe he averaged 40 kilometers a day. That made 120 kilometers. Then he walked 1 full day with his boy, and most of that night alone, almost all of it directly south. So add on at least another 60 to make 180 kilometers. Plus this afternoon in the boat, that made a grand total of 220 to 230 at a conservative estimate. It couldn't be that much farther to the Black Sea. So, side note, a kilometer is equal to 0.62 miles. So at this point, Roberto has made it about 142 miles on his own by his estimate. Moving on. He pulled off his right glove and let his hand hang over the edge so that his fingertips played in the snow-fed water. He wasn't afraid of getting cold. The sun would last another few hours. The river flowed south to southeast. Things were going well for the moment. He thought about the hot goat milk at breakfast and about the roll his boy had given him. It seemed hunger was the plague of his life, but the roll had taken off the edge. He'd been much hungrier than this before, and he'd been much hungrier again. He resisted the temptation to stop and search for food. He had to be patient and do things in the right order. He was traveling well now. He should keep traveling. So long as he was on water, he had nothing to fear. But he did need a rest if he was going to travel well. So he let himself drift. A small house came into view on the east shore, and another beyond it. Roberto's mouth went dry. He put on his glove, got to his knees, and paddled for the opposite shore. A shout came across the water. Roberto looked in panic. 2 small boys waved at him from the shore. Their faces wore wide grins. Roberto swallowed his fear. He was dressed totally in peasant clothes. He could be a Ukrainian boy himself. He waved back. The boys waved until he was out of sight. Roberto paddled slowly now. The village was small, and of the houses Roberto could see, maybe half were abandoned, like in the big town. What was going on? A woman stood at the shore with a small herd of goats. Roberto didn't hesitate this time. He waved wildly at her. She stared at him. He grinned and kept waving. Then he paddled furiously. The village was behind him now. He looked over his shoulder. No little boats had slid into the water. No one had followed. He paddled all the rest of the day. The wind blew from the south now, a wet, heavy wind. He felt he recognized it. Was it wind off salt water? Was it already? Roberto passed another settlement, no larger than his boys, without seeing a soul. A road ran through the settlement and off over a hill in one direction and then along the side of the river to the south. But Roberto was lucky. The road had no traffic. Up ahead, a bridge crossed the river. Another small settlement appeared. Roberto paddled steadily, alert and ready. He passed under a bridge. The road went through the village and continued south. Both road and water were still untraveled. The river widened with each passing kilometer. Roberto stayed in the center. A half hour later, Roberto came to another town, always on the east bank. This one was big, about the size of the town he'd spent the night in last night, and it was much busier. And what was that? The road along the river was piled high with sandbags, higher than a man's height. Roberto remembered the soldier at the farm camp laughing at how the Soviets hid behind the sandbags. These people were ready for battle. If they saw Roberto on the river, they might not wait for him to wave. They might shoot on sight. Roberto quickly paddled over to the opposite bank and hugged the shore, staying in the shadows of the trees as the sun set. The foliage was dense, and with luck, he wouldn't be seen. There were boats on the town bank, large ones. The river had turned markedly deeper. Of course, this town was a port. Roberto dipped his hand in the water and tasted. It wasn't very salty, not like the Adriatic Sea off of Venice, but it was seawater for sure. Roberto had finally arrived at his first goal, the Black Sea. It should be a moment of celebration, but his mind couldn't savor the victory. It spun on. What next? He needed a plan. When he'd first thought of all this through, he'd imagined walking the whole coast of the Black Sea, but he had the boat now. If he stayed close to shore, he'd be safer in the boat than walking. And even with the waves of the sea, it would be a lot faster. No matter what, he'd arrive at the strait through Turkey to the Mediterranean Sea within a week, or 10 days at the very most. The Mediterranean Sea. His own Mediterranean Sea. The thought made his throat thick with longing. It was far. From here all the way back to Venice had to be close to 2,000 kilometers as the bird flies. Going by water, staying close to the shore, it could be double that, triple, maybe. But he could do it. So long as he stayed on water, he could do it. Roberto climbed onto the shore and pulled the boat behind him. He pushed it under bushes. Then he turned it upside down. He would sleep under the boat. He got down on his knees and started to crawl under the bushes. That's when he felt a blow across the back of his neck.